I'm going to be talking about history, basically, and showing you some images as well. One of my professional colleagues has always felt that you need to visualize history. So when I did my first article on tea and sent out off-prints of the article, she had me put it in a little tea bag to indicate what that was all about. A few years later, I gave a paper on rhubarb in China. So we went all over New York trying to find a sprig of rhubarb I could put in my lapel while giving the talk. I suppose today she would have wanted me in a Mongolian dell, one of these fantastic rows, which I'll show you in the slides a little bit later on. I haven't told her that my next project is on Chinese eunuchs, for fear of what that might bring. I don't know how to switch from eunuchs to Mongols. There's no solid way of doing that. But let me start off by saying that, thank you so much, that usually the Mongols have been portrayed as barbarians, portrayed as people who went in, destroyed towns, villages, cities, massacred millions, and that is true. That is in part true. I don't want to deny that. But in fact, they were going to have a very important influence, and in particular, an influence on as promoters of Islam in various parts of their domains. And I'm going to try to show you that as we go along. In the 1980s, that image of the Mongols as barbarians persisted, and a few of us in the Mongol field, all two of us, decided that we ought to, try to bring in the more positive elements. So that's what I'm going to try to do without going overboard. Some people over the past, some popularizers have tried to point out that Genghis Khan was a Democrat, that Genghis Khan somehow or other founded international law. Yeah, he really believed in international law as long as the Mongols decided what that was. So, you don't want to go too overboard on that. First, let's look at Mongolia. Mongolia is huge. You can't tell from this map too much, but it is about 3 times the size of France, and with a population even today of only 3 million people. It's the least densely populated country in the world. And yet, with a population of less than 1 million people, they created the largest land empire in world history, starting all the way from Korea, and they got to Hungary, they got to Georgia, Armenia, the Middle East, and what I'll be talking about mostly is their promotion of Islam here in China and in the Middle East. They also had an impact on Russia, and a lot of the Mongol Khans in Russia converted to Islam. So there's a story there, but I can't deal with it all. So I'll stick to basically China and Central Asia. The Mongols are a nomadic people. They wandered around. We want to start with the Mongols first. They wandered around trying to find water and grass for their animals. And so they had to have a tent or living circumstances that they could quickly dismantle. I've seen people, Mongols today, put up a tent like this in about 45 minutes and then dismantle it within 45 minutes. They're very handy, they're cool in summer, and they're with a stove, they can be readily warm in winter. They're dependent on horses. Horses make them a powerful force, a powerful military force. And so it's no accident that you find representations, as we'll see all along, of images of horses during the Mongol period, both in Islam and in this case in terms of China. The greatest painter of the Chinese tradition of that period, Zhao Mengfu, painted this particular picture for his Mongol patron Kublai Khan. The Chinese knew what was good for them in terms of getting support. In Persia, we have Genghis Khan here at the very top, receiving tribute from a wide variety of tribute bearers from a wide variety of countries. another indication of the tremendous impact that the Mongols would have. Kublai Khan, his Genghis Khan's grandson, who really brought the empire to its height. Genghis Khan was a conqueror. Kublai Khan was the man who set up a government and who set up the proper institutions for the rule of in China. Kublai Khan's wife, you'll notice she's quite bedecked, and particularly if you'll notice her headwear. According to legend, which may or may not be accurate, the Mongol women didn't have a headwear. And so when the Mongol women helped the men in a battle against the Chinese, the men wanted to reward them, and they decided to provide them with a headgear. But they didn't want the women to get a swelled head, so this is in the form of an inverted boot, so they would know that they were always under the heels of the men, supposedly. This is Kublai Khan, an actual painting done in the 1280s. He's changed a lot since the initial painting. He's wearing very elaborate ermine coat and very elaborate silk and so on, and has obviously liked Chinese food. Marco Polo tells us that there was no single horse that could sustain Kublai's weight. He had to be carried around on elephants eventually. Now we come to the Islamic portion, and we find Kublai Khan in the black figure there, represented in Islamic art and looking quite different. It looks more Caucasoid than Mongoloid. Kublai Khan in European format becomes even more Western. These are the two Polo brothers, Marco Polo's father and his uncle, and being greeted by Kublai Khan. I don't think the scene was quite that way. Tremendous cultural and artistic interchange characterized the Mongol period. We'll see that quite frequently a little bit later on. You'd think that this was a Chinese celadon, and it is actually the Iranians, through the Mongols, getting knowledge about ceramics, getting knowledge about textiles, who began imitating Chinese patterns, Chinese porcelains, Chinese textiles, and this is one example of that. Iranian, again, the representation of a phoenix, which is a typical Chinese motif. The phoenix represents the Chinese empress, and yet because of the Mongols transferring the ideas of this motif to Iran, this is an Iranian plate. Again, the phoenix in tile work that comes from a palace that was excavated, the summer palace of the Iranians in a place called Takht-i-Suleiman, the throne of Solomon. So the Mongols, just from this, played a very important artistic role. A dragon coming from the same location, from Takht-i-Suleiman, in tile work. A depiction of the India and Nepal that again, the Mongols exposed the Iranians to civilizations around them, and you see the clothing is accurate. The Chinese influence is through the mountains. If you know Chinese landscape painting, these crenellated hills and mountains are very typical of Chinese landscape work. And so the Iranians, through the Mongols, were made aware of Chinese images and incorporated them into their work. A work produced in China, this time, of a wide variety of civilizations. This is a mandala, a Buddhist textile that incorporates up here Tibetans, famous Tibetan mystics, an Indian motif here of a Buddhist figure, Persian motifs over here. We'll come to those a little bit later on. But I want to talk, let me move on. I want to talk a little bit now about how this all came about. And it all came about through the Mongol Khans, in particular Genghis Khan, and then his grandson Kublai Khan brought into play the impact of the Mongols on Islam. Genghis Khan, I've had a kind of a funny relationship with Genghis Khan. About 2 years ago, a reporter named Robert Krulewicz, who some of you may know, he does science work for ABC News and for National Public Radio, asked me to, if he could interview me about Genghis Khan. I said, sure. So we went to a diner on 2 blocks away from my apartment on 90th Street and Broadway. And I started talking. I was fantastically articulate. For 2 hours, we went on. I told him about his life, his career, his significance, and so on. And then he said, well, he died, right? I said, yeah, he died, probably of natural causes. He said, was there anything colorful? I thought and thought. Well, I said there's some crazy wacko story that he took a concubine, he took as a concubine one of the wives of one of his opponents when he killed the opponent. And this particular wife was not keen to be a concubine of Genghis Khan. And so she hid, supposedly, a knife in her vagina. And as they were having sex, that was the end of Genghis Khan. The guy put on the radio performance. The only thing he put on was this story. And it gets even worse because my brother-in-law is the chair of the board of trustees of NPR. And so he wrote an email to the board saying, you know, my brother-in-law, brilliant scholar, lots of languages, knows lots of languages, going to be on Friday. You have to listen to him. The board people listen in, and I'm talking about vaginas. So I have a funny relationship to Mr. Genghis Khan. And, in any case, Genghis started this whole ball rolling of interacting with Muslims. He started trade with Muslims, and he recognized that the Muslims were consummate traders, consummate merchants, and that set up a kind of perfect relationship between Genghis and the Muslims. He also was tolerant religiously. There was never any discrimination against any religion in the Mongol domains. You don't find any persecution of whether it be Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, and so that again provided the framework for Muslim interaction with the Mongols, and in particular with Genghis Khan. And unlike what you may have heard, the Mongols loved beautiful objects, and so they were very keen to get Muslim craftsmen. The Muslims were among the great craftsmen in pottery, in textiles, and so they had a favorable position, they had a favored position in the Mongol domains. In fact, Genghis ordered his men never to harm any craftsman. And there's a famous story when they took the city of Samarkand in Central Asia, that 30,000 craftsmen were spared and were taken by the Mongols and moved to China. So there was a real relationship that developed between the Mongols and the Muslims from the very beginning. The Mongols also, in terms of when we talk about China, when they started to rule China, they actually did want to rule and not simply pillage China. You can't rule a country if you don't have the administrative skills, and the Mongols did not have those skills. They were a tribal people. They had never ruled a vast empire, and yet they didn't want to be aided simply by Chinese. So they brought in Muslims from Persia, Central Asia, to help them in ruling China, and that too established a very strong relationship between Islam and the Mongols. And the result was that the Muslims had tremendous positions in China during the Mongol era. One became a governor of the important province of Yunnan, southwestern province that the Mongols had just incorporated into China, and they delegated a Muslim to be the governor of that region. They brought in Muslim merchants to help in trade with the Muslim world, with Central Asia, Iran, the Middle East. They recruited craftsmen, particularly weavers. The Muslims in the Middle East were great weavers, and they brought them to China to incorporate Muslim themes, Muslim images into the textiles that were produced in China at that point. The Mongols particularly liked gold, and so gold thread was often used in some of the some of the textiles that were produced during that time. But in every area, the Muslims had made tremendous breakthroughs, and the Mongols recognized it. So the Mongols recognized that the Muslims in Persia had extraordinary knowledge in astronomy. And so they recruited astronomers to come to China to build an observatory, to build astronomical instruments that the Chinese could use. They recognized the tremendous achievements in medicine that were made in Iran. And so they recruited Persian doctors to come treat them. The Mongols had a rough kind of life. They made it worse by drinking a lot. So they needed medical help in a variety of ways. And so they recruited these Persian doctors into China. They brought Persian medical texts to China, translated them into Chinese so that the Chinese doctors could treat them properly, could treat the Mongols properly. And a good friend of mine believes that the Mongol Empire actually collapsed because of dietary decadence. The Mongols, when they were up here in Mongolia, there was not much food there. They had no agriculture. They had just their animals. And they didn't have anything to drink except mare's milk, fermented mare's milk, which only came around in the fall. So they could get plastered in the fall, but no other time of year. Once they took over China and Iran, they could drink to their heart's content and eat to their heart's content. And this friend of mine believes that was one of the reasons that things collapsed for the Mongols. And what he did was to take the lifespans of Mongol rulers. He found Kublai Khan, for example, early Mongol, lived to 79 years. When you keep going to the rest of the Khans, they die in their 30s and 40s, in part because they ate a lot and drank a lot. So they really needed Persian doctors. The Muslims also, a Muslim was the architect for the building of Beijing, which became, for the first time, a capital of China. Let me start you off right here. This is a picture done in, an image done in Iran of a Mongol horseman, and you'll notice that it's a very good one. It shows that the Mongol horses were tiny. Unlike the Arabian horses, which are strong, sturdy, the Mongol horses are small and speedy. What the Mongols needed was mobility in warfare, and so it was ideal to have a small horse in that way. You'll notice the grass here, very typical of Chinese art of that time period. So they were undoubtedly influenced by the Chinese. This is an amazing thing, actually. This is a cenotaph that was found in Inner Mongolia, 6,000 miles from the Middle East, and yet, if you'll see, Here on the side, there's an Arabic inscription. An Arabic inscription 6,000 miles from the Middle East that was produced for a Muslim who died in Inner Mongolia. And it's a part of the Quran. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger, is what that says. Again, this, as I pointed out earlier, this Takht-i-Suleiman with the dragon design comes directly from China. The dragon is the symbol of the emperor, and it never existed in Persian art before. There was no dragon per se in that sense that existed. There were dragons, but not in the Chinese form. Same thing with the phoenix, which represents Chinese emperors. Again, you'd think this was Chinese landscape. Very typical. The waves down here, if you've seen dragon robes, which have this wave at the very bottom of the Chinese dragon robes, and the water, the waving water coming up into a crest. The trees, the gnarled trees, come directly from Chinese landscape painting, and yet this work was done in Iran. The only people who could have conveyed it in that way were the Mongols. And they were, of course, the patrons of this kind of art. The Mongols, as I said, loved beautiful objects, whether it be paintings, textiles, ceramics, whatever. And this is a painting in Iran, and an enthronement of a Khan. And if you remember that headwear that Kublai's wife was wearing, they knew exactly what it looked like in Iran and portrayed it exactly properly as it should be. And so the Iranian painters profited enormously from, the Iranian artists profited enormously from contacts with the Mongols. A mosque. This is a rather unusual, unusual looking mosque. It's a tent, a Mongol tent. And if you notice, these are Mongol figures who are put the Quran here on a prayer stand and are reading from the Quran. Here they're being listened to by people with those hats. Again, a tremendous impact that the Mongols had on the artists of that period. It's important to remember that the Mongols were not the artists. They were not the craftsmen, they were not the artists. It was Iranians, Chinese, and others. But it wouldn't have been produced had it not been for Mongol patronage. This is, again, a depiction which has a lot of Chinese images. The water, the waves and the water comes directly from Chinese landscape painting. This is a depiction of the conquest of Baghdad, which has been portrayed in the Middle East as one of the worst disasters in world history. Supposedly the Mongols came in 1258 and killed 800,000 people in Baghdad. Now the problem with that, of course, is that the population of Baghdad was about 200,000 at that point, so it's a little bit exaggerated. But again, the depictions are great of the Mongols themselves, their weaponry, the kinds of weapons they had, the archery down here. The Mongols were the great archers of traditional times, and they had a bow and arrow that had a much wider range, much longer range than any other bow and arrow of that time period. The effective rate of their bow and arrow was about 350 feet. The closest of any other was the English longbow, which had a range of about 150 feet. That in part explains their success at taking over this entire world, this entire Asian world. The students always ask in my Mongol history course, how did the Mongols with less than 1 million people, take over a China of 75 million people, Central Asia, maybe 5 million, Russia, another 10 million, Middle East, another 15, 20 million. In part, it was weaponry. They had the bow and arrow, they had the mobility provided by the horse, they had tremendous cavalries. The only times they failed were when they tried not to use their cavalry, when they tried to attack Japan, which was a naval expedition, or tried to attack Java in Indonesia. That was a failure. But when they had their horses and their cavalry and their bows and arrows, they were a formidable force. But that wasn't the only reason. Another major reason was the fact that all of these other civilizations were going downhill. China was divided up into 3 separate dynasties. It wasn't united. Russia didn't exist. It was a series of city-states, so the Mongols could take one city-state after another. The Middle East, the Abbasid dynasty in Baghdad was going downhill. And it was relatively easy, amazing that the Mongols were able to move in so expeditiously into Baghdad without much of a sweat, actually. They moved in 2 days. They took the capital of Baghdad. Some years ago, there was an exhibition which I was involved in at the Met called The Legacy of Genghis Khan, and this particular thing was shown, this particular image. Kofi Annan was being taken around by myself and Stefano Carboni, the curator at the Met, and he looked at this and he said, yeah, this was before the Iraq War and all, he said, yeah, the Mongols did it in 2 days. We didn't necessarily agree that it was the best thing to be said, but anyway. The other thing that I noticed quite a number of women here, and actually the women were quite important because the women could take care of the economy. They could take care of all the animals. So you had total male mobilization for warfare. And that facilitated and led to a lot of their victories. Plates. The Mongols and the Middle East loved Chinese porcelains. A tremendous number of Chinese porcelains were imported into the Middle East, and some of the great collections of Chinese porcelains are found in the Middle East, partly through the Mongols. The Mongols alerted the Middle Easterners to the fact that the Chinese were producing this stuff, and they also alerted Chinese potters to the taste that the Muslims would have. For example, they like big plates, unlike the Chinese. The Chinese eat in small bowls. But the Islamic world have large plates in which they eat their meat and rice and so on. And so you find that a lot of Chinese potters producing for this external market in these kind of big plates with Chinese designs. There's no question that these are Chinese designs, plants and animals of all sorts. Mongols had the idea of producing a written language that could be used with all of the languages in their domains. Everything from Chinese to Arabic to their own Mongolian script to Persian. And this is the script that they developed. It's a combination of Tibetan and Sanskrit. The problem that the Mongols did not understand was that it's very difficult to impose a language from on top. Languages develop from the people. And they tried in a variety of ways. They ordered people to use this universal alphabet, which is actually quite good. It can reproduce Arabic sounds, can reproduce Persian, Mongol, so on. So the only things they were used for were things like passports. This is a passport guaranteeing safe passage for anyone traveling throughout the Mongol domains, and threatens anybody who challenges a traveler with this kind of thing, you'll earn the Khan's wrath if you tangle with this guy. And here's another shape. You could put that in, I guess, your pants and hook it on, and it would serve the same purpose. Now, the Mongols also were very big on architecture and on producing, helping Muslims in particular develop spectacular mosques and madrasas, that is theological colleges. And this particular one survives. It's in the city of Quanzhou, and Mongols and Muslims provided the funds for the building of this mosque. Quite different from mosques that you find in the Middle East, but nonetheless still exists. A stele or a slab from a cemetery. A cemetery was been found in this place in China with Arabic inscriptions of all sorts, which again, the Mongols encouraged Muslims and gave them tremendous rewards if they were craftsmen or weavers or others to come to China. And this is one of the people who came to China and eventually became a governor of a particular region. And this was his funerary stele. The Mongols were ecumenical, and I just wanted to show you evidence that it was not just Islam that they patronized and provided funds for, but this is Nestorian, evidence of Nestorian influence in China, Nestorian headstones of all sorts, with a cross at the very top. This again comes from China, and you'll find Chinese motifs here, plants of all sorts, with the cross at the very top. An angel, again coming from a Nestorian headstone in southern China. A scene from ceramics was produced in Iran, again subsidized by the Mongols. The story about this is that a man had a dream in which he saw Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad, and a pivotal figure in the Shiite form of Islam. And in this dream, Ali said that he was going to leave this area and go to India to convert the people of India, but he wanted others to come to this area and be converted as well. So he said that in the place where there were camel and horse hooves, that's where a mosque should be built. The man wakes up, and lo and behold, there are camel and horse hooves there. Kind of a great miracle, and they did build a mosque, and this is a ceramic reflecting that tradition. The Mongols, in fact, were very important in terms of Islamic religion as well. They didn't necessarily cotton to Sunnite or Shiite beliefs. They were very interested in Sufism, the mystical version of Islam, because it didn't require tremendous intellectual knowledge or intellectual pursuits. And so Sufism in particular was very much supported and patronized by the Mongols in Iran. The other thing that the Mongols supported was Iranian poetry. This was one of the great periods in the poetry of Iran, and historical writing. Probably the first universal history ever written was written by a Persian at the command of the Mongols, a Persian who was kind of the Renaissance figure of his time and is hardly known outside his area. a man named Rashid ad-Din, who was actually Jewish but converted to Islam, a true Renaissance man. He became prime minister of Iran under the Mongols. They were willing to use Muslims in that way. He was commissioned to write this history of the Mongols because the Mongols felt that the Mongol Khan felt that people were pretty far away from Mongolia and had lost their connection with Mongol history. He started with Mongol history and then it expanded to history of Islam, history of China, history of the Franks or the Europeans, history of the Jews, and it was the first universal history. The first global history. And it was only translated into English only about 15 years ago in a sort of mimeograph form by a guy at Harvard. And that's the reason why his work is not better known. I remember when I was a graduate student at Columbia, everybody had to take this course on historiography, the great historians of the past. And so Fritz Stern, a great luminary historian at Columbia, would come and talk about a guy named Mommsen, a great German historian. Richard Hofstadter came and talked about some great American historian. And every doctoral candidate had to take this course. At the end of the course, the man who was supervising the course said, you know, if you have any suggestions, come up and see me and we'll talk. So stupidly, I went up. And I said, well, it's a great course. We had the great history department at Columbia, terrific people. But have you ever thought of including Asian historians? And he turned to me with a straight face and he said, are there any? I don't know if there'd be that much change in the attitude of Columbia historians at the moment. Maybe, I shouldn't say that, they probably would. But this is Rashid ad-Din was the great historian of the past and unfortunately is not amazingly well known. This depiction actually is of the death of Moses and is a horrendous, sorry, it's a death of Moses, the next one. This is a funeral scene and you'll notice that it's done in Iran and yet it has the quintessential Buddhist symbol, the lotus, indicating the interaction, the diffusion of motifs and in this period brought about by the Mongols having taken over all of this region. This depiction is of, you know, we're often told that there's no human figures in Islamic art, so on. Not true. This is a depiction of the birth of Muhammad. So Muhammad is portrayed as an infant, and you notice the Christian elements, the angels here. This comes from Rashid ad-Din's work, the great historian. And the fact is that there are depictions of humans in Islamic art. It was only later on that this became more difficult to do and became prohibited. The death of Moses, and again you notice the impact of Chinese art. You notice these figures are often portrayed in Byzantine funeral scenes. So the Mongols brought all of these peoples together, albeit in a violent way, but they actually sought to support art, culture in a variety of different ways. They sponsored areas that appealed to them. They were not going to sponsor great philosophical works. They weren't going to sponsor Chinese essayists, but they did sponsor Chinese drama. They sponsored Islamic historiography, Islamic poetry, Islamic art. And one doesn't want to ignore the damage they did to world culture and world history, but they also provided and facilitated the development of a great Islamic period in both China and Iran.